We have done what we have been obliged to do. So what are we obligated to do? Serve, certainly our gospel would suggest to us, but what are we obliged to do? Well, the prophet Habakkuk would tell us in today's first reading, we are obliged to write down the vision, put it on a tablet. Habakkuk knew that we are all visual learners. Write it down, the vision. Well, then we got to figure out what the vision is. Well, Paul helps us with that in today's second reading. The vision is to stir into flame the gift which is God, given to you by you and I by the imposition of hands. Write down the vision, stir into flame, do what we're obliged to do. I don't know about you, but I find it more comforting oftentimes in my life to be less than who I am. How about you? Do you find it comforting to be less than who you are? Oh, come on, be honest. We do, don't we? By being less than who we are, it enables you and I to let ourselves off the hook. It enables you and I to come up with all kinds of excuses. It enables you and I to be able to say no at times. It enables you and I to pass the buck. It enables you and I to simply say, it's not in me to get it done. It's comforting at times to be less than who I truly am. The disciples suffered from that all the time. They're on their way to Jerusalem. It's what Luke has the disciples and Jesus doing throughout his gospel. And so today, as they continue on their way to Jerusalem, the disciples, they just don't get it. They can't figure it out. They don't know who this Jesus is. On the one hand, they think they do, and on the other hand, he does things that just baffle them. And so, of course, they don't want to admit that they just don't get it. So what do? Because they're always less than who they really are, they simply make a request. Lord, could you just increase our faith? Could you just give us more? Because that must be the answer. That must be the secret to being able to help us move from this ignorance, this not getting it, to perhaps finally understanding what it is, Jesus, you want us to be about. The disciples were always being less than who they were. You remember, don't you? In Mark's gospel, the disciples, it's late, it's night, they've been with this huge crowd all day long, and so what do? They go to Jesus and they say, hey, Jesus, it's late. Send them home. Send them packing. Get rid of them. It's late. They need to go and get something to eat. What were the disciples implying? They were really implying, it's late, we're tired, and we want to get something to eat. But what does Jesus say to them? Because, of course, he realizes that they're comfortable in being less than who they are. He says to them, you give them something to eat. What? They say. How could we possibly do that? Why, it would take hundreds of days' wages in order to accomplish that. And then Jesus asks them, in the midst of their wanting to be less than who they are, always focusing in on what they don't have and their scarcity that they're convinced which is their life, Jesus says, what do you got? 5 loaves, 2 fish. Okay, that'll be enough. And he helps them recognize who they are. Disciples who are willing then to take what there is, and they will distribute it, and they will collect it up. So there's comfort in being less than who we are. There's also a huge risk, might I suggest, a huge danger in being more than who we are. Because oftentimes when we go down that road, why then we find ourselves having to eventually swallow this very difficult pill called humility. Somebody is always bound to remind us that we're not as important, we're not as intelligent, we're not as great as we make ourselves out to be, because there's also the danger in being more than who we are to somehow think that we are in charge, that somehow we can save ourselves, that somehow we can become God. So we have both sides of the story. Comfort in being less than who we are, the danger of being more than who we are. So what are we obliged to do? Who should we be? And how should we go about being it? Well, Jesus will tell us that the very first thing we need to understand in today's gospel, that it's not about quantity, it's not about size, it's not about how much. Simply, Jesus says, in order for you and I to be who we truly are, we need to recognize the gift of faith. That it is not something that is a possession, it's not a property, it's not something that can be measured and or quantified. Faith, my friends, I am convinced the longer that I live here on earth, it is not a noun, it's a verb. Faith is a verb. That's what Jesus wants you and I to understand in today's gospel. That's who we need to become. People whose faith stirs into flame the very gift which is God present in our life. You see, what Jesus wants of you and I, as those unprofitable servants that he speaks of at the end of today's gospel, again, a reminder to us not to run into or fall down the road of being more than who we are. He simply wants you and I to understand that as unprofitable servants, as people who are simply doing what we are obliged to do, what we need to do is Jesus simply wants us to go into the kingdom. He wants us to go in. As the old story that I've told before in a homily before, you know, the moment when I was at the grocery store and the outdoor wasn't working, that automatic door that wasn't working, and I walked up to try to leave the store, and the manager had put a sign on the door, and the sign simply read, "The only way out is in." The only way out is in. Meaning, of course, I had to go to the indoors to get out of the store. But there's a truth to that statement, isn't it? Oftentimes, the only way out is to go into ourselves, to recognize that, of course, the problem is not out there. The difficulty is not out there. Our being called to serve as disciples is not somebody else out there. The only way out is into certainly reflecting upon who we are, the gifts that God has given to us, and then, having gone in, then we go into the kingdom, God's kingdom, which is a kingdom that looks different and wishes to act differently than the world in which we live. It's a kingdom of peace, and it's a kingdom of reconciliation, and it's a kingdom of forgiveness, and it's a kingdom of service, of putting other people before ourselves. It's a kingdom of compassion. It's a kingdom of mercy. It's a kingdom where everybody is looked upon with respect and dignity and is treated as such. That, my friends, is the kingdom. That, my friends, is what you and I are invited into. That, my friends, is what faith is. It's a belief in God that so moves you and I that we become disciples who go into the kingdom. And there we find it's not about quantity, it's not about property, it's not about something that we hold on to. No, faith is something given to us that we might stir into flame, so that God, who is all and in all, might be made known through you and I as his disciples at work in his kingdom, increasing this gift of faith that is ours, a faith that calls you and I to action.